It started with a sealed briefing inside Buckingham Palace just before dawn, an emergency-level meeting so tightly controlled that even longtime palace aides were reportedly denied entry. Yet when Princess Catherine emerged nearly 40 minutes later beside Prince William, something had shifted. The calm smile the public knew so well was gone, replaced by the unmistakable weight of responsibility. Within hours, whispers began spreading through royal corridors that the palace was preparing to confirm a role so significant it could permanently reshape the balance of power inside the monarchy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The timing alone sent shockwaves through royal circles. According to insiders, black vehicles carrying senior constitutional advisors began arriving through private palace entrances long before sunrise, carefully avoiding the attention of the press stationed outside Buckingham Palace gates. Even some trusted staff members were reportedly told to remain away from sensitive corridors while discussions unfolded behind closed doors. That level of secrecy was not normal. In a family built on protocol, silence often speaks louder than announcements, and this silence felt deliberate, calculated, almost urgent. By mid-morning, speculation had already exploded among royal commentators who sensed that something far larger than a routine internal meeting was quietly taking shape behind palace walls. At the center of it all stood Catherine. For years, she had been viewed as the monarchy's steady anchor, the royal figure capable of calming public uncertainty without ever appearing to seek influence for herself. But this moment felt different. Sources close to the institution began hinting that Catherine had allegedly been presented with a new responsibility tied directly to safeguarding the crown's long-term future. The implications were enormous. This was no ceremonial adjustment. This was about trust, about stability, about deciding who the monarchy believed could carry its image through an era of growing instability, internal tension, and relentless public scrutiny. And perhaps most striking of all was the reported reaction from Prince William himself. Insiders described him as unwaveringly supportive during discussions that were said to have become increasingly tense as questions about succession planning and the king's ongoing health concerns hovered heavily over the room. What made the situation even more explosive was the growing belief that King Charles had personally approved the transition before the meeting ever began. That detail changed everything, because if true, it suggested the palace was no longer thinking only about the present, it was quietly preparing for the future at a pace far faster than the public realized. Commentators who once dismissed rumors of accelerated succession planning suddenly began revisiting every recent royal appearance, every carefully staged engagement, every subtle shift in hierarchy that now appeared impossible to ignore. Catherine's growing visibility beside William no longer looked symbolic. It looked strategic, intentional, as though the monarchy had already started positioning its next generation of leadership while attempting to avoid triggering public alarm. Inside the palace, however, the atmosphere reportedly became far more complicated than the polished statements later released to the press. Staff members were allegedly instructed to avoid discussing the briefing entirely, while senior aides scrambled to contain the wave of speculation spreading through media networks across Britain. Yet the harder the institution tried to suppress the whispers, the louder they became. Royal insiders began describing a growing realization within the family itself that the monarchy's survival now depended less on tradition and more on public confidence in individuals capable of carrying emotional trust. And in those conversations, Catherine's name reportedly kept returning to the center. Not because of ambition, not because of status, but because the palace increasingly viewed her as the figure most capable of protecting the crown during a period when uncertainty inside the monarchy had become impossible to hide. But the deeper truth behind Catherine's new role was not simply about public duty, it was about who the monarchy now trusted to protect its future when the pressure inside the palace became impossible to ignore. For months, royal watchers had sensed that something fundamental was changing behind palace walls. Catherine was no longer being positioned merely as the graceful future queen beside William. According to various interpretations coming from palace administrative circles, she was quietly being prepared for something far more influential, a role once reserved only for the monarchy's most trusted inner guardians. And now, with Buckingham Palace finally confirming the transition, the old structure of royal power appeared to be entering a dramatic new phase. What once appeared to be subtle adjustments in royal scheduling suddenly carried a far deeper meaning. Catherine's presence at private strategy meetings, diplomatic briefings, and high-level planning discussions was no longer being dismissed as routine preparation for future queenship. Insiders began describing something much more deliberate unfolding behind the scenes. During years when the monarchy faced relentless turbulence from public, division to personal scandals and growing uncertainty surrounding the institution's future, King Charles reportedly began viewing Catherine as one of the few figures capable of restoring calm without provoking further instability. That trust, according to palace sources, did not emerge overnight. It was built quietly through years of restraint, discipline, and an almost surgical understanding of when to step forward and when to remain silent. As pressure mounted around the crown, Catherine's role reportedly expanded far beyond ceremonial appearances. Palace insiders claimed she was gradually given greater influence over charitable direction, international outreach, and even delicate diplomatic initiatives that once remained firmly controlled by senior royal advisors. The shift was subtle enough to avoid public alarm, yet significant enough for longtime courtiers to notice the changing balance inside royal operations. Some allegedly began referring to her privately as the monarchy's steady hand, a phrase that carried enormous weight within an institution where loyalty and stability are treated almost like sacred currency. And perhaps most revealing of all was how naturally William appeared beside her throughout the transition. Gone was the image of a prince carrying the future alone. Increasingly, the palace presented William and Catherine as a united leadership force, carefully synchronized, emotionally disciplined, and prepared to shoulder responsibilities that once seemed years away. The comparisons to Queen Elizabeth II's early transition years only intensified the speculation. Royal historians and commentators quietly began drawing parallels between Catherine's growing authority and the late Queen's gradual rise during periods of uncertainty decades earlier. Not because the circumstances were identical, but because the monarchy has always relied on figures capable of reassuring the public during moments of institutional fragility. And in Catherine, many inside the palace reportedly believed they had found exactly that. Public support surrounding her continued to strengthen, reinforcing confidence within royal circles that she represented continuity rather than disruption. Every appearance, every carefully chosen statement, every measured response seemed to deepen the perception that Catherine had become far more than a symbolic royal figure. She was becoming a stabilizing force at the exact moment the monarchy feared instability most. But beneath the carefully controlled public messaging, tension reportedly simmered behind closed doors, because power inside royal institutions is rarely transferred without consequence. The more Catherine's influence appeared to grow, the more whispers began circulating about discomfort among certain palace figures unprepared for how rapidly her authority was evolving. Some insiders allegedly feared that the traditional hierarchy inside the monarchy was quietly being rewritten in real time, with Catherine emerging not simply as a future queen consort, but as one of the central decision-makers, shaping the institution's survival strategy for generations ahead. And as those whispers spread deeper through aristocratic circles, one unsettling question reportedly began echoing behind palace walls. If Catherine had truly become the monarchy's most trusted guardian, what would that mean for everyone else still fighting to protect their own place within the crown's fragile inner circle? Yet while the public celebrated the announcement as a symbol of unity, insiders whisper that not everyone inside royal circles welcomed Catherine's rising authority with the same enthusiasm. Behind the polished ceremonies and carefully rehearsed smiles, Buckingham Palace was reportedly becoming the centre of increasingly difficult internal conversations. Different interpretations of recent royal scheduling changes suggested that Catherine's influence had expanded far faster than many expected. And with every new responsibility placed in her hands, the atmosphere surrounding senior royal dynamics allegedly grew colder, more cautious, and increasingly divided between those embracing modernization and those fearing the quiet redistribution of influence. At first, the adjustments seemed minor enough to escape public attention. A revised appearance schedule here, a diplomatic briefing there, a last-minute change placing Catherine at the centre of future state events once dominated by more senior royal figures. But inside palace corridors, according to those familiar with the institution's internal operations, these were not random administrative decisions. They were signals. Carefully calculated signals pointing toward a monarchy preparing for transition at a speed that unsettled even long-time insiders. Royal aides reportedly began restructuring portions of operational planning around William and Catherine with a level of urgency that many described as impossible to ignore. Meetings once filtered through layers of senior advisors allegedly started reaching the Wales household more directly, reinforcing growing perceptions that the future was no longer being prepared quietly in the distance it was already arriving. That realization reportedly intensified tensions behind closed doors. Some insiders described a generational shift accelerating deep inside the institution, one that carried enormous emotional and political consequences for figures who had spent decades navigating the monarchy's traditional hierarchy. Because while public attention remained fixed on ceremonial unity, internal reality appeared far more fragile. Every expanded role Catherine accepted seemed to strengthen her influence while simultaneously raising uncomfortable questions about how power inside the palace was being redistributed. And the deeper those questions became, the more carefully royal officials appeared to guard their words in public. During press inquiries, palace representatives reportedly adopted an unusually restrained tone, avoiding direct clarification while refusing to deny the growing speculation surrounding Catherine's evolving authority. Behind that silence, however, reports continued emerging that King Charles had developed increasing trust in Catherine's judgment during sensitive institutional matters. That detail carried enormous weight within royal circles, because trust inside the monarchy is rarely given freely, especially during periods of uncertainty. Sources suggested Catherine had become heavily involved in discussions tied to Commonwealth relationships, diplomatic preparation, and long-term strategic engagements intended to protect the Crown's international standing. For many observers, this marked a profound transformation in how the palace viewed her role. She was no longer simply supporting the monarchy's future, she was actively shaping it. And the more visible that transformation became, the more media commentators began openly questioning what the shift might mean for other senior royals, whose influence now appeared increasingly uncertain. The emotional undercurrent surrounding the transition reportedly became impossible to ignore. Some insiders allegedly viewed Catherine's rise as necessary for the monarchy's survival, believing her calm discipline and broad public support offered stability during a deeply volatile period. Others, however, quietly feared that the institution was moving too quickly, placing enormous pressure on a new generation before the old structure had fully loosened its grip. Those conflicting perspectives created an atmosphere many described as tense, guarded, and emotionally exhausting behind palace walls. Every public appearance suddenly carried hidden meaning. Every scheduling adjustment fueled new speculation. Every carefully measured statement deepened the sense that Buckingham Palace was attempting to manage a transformation far larger than it was prepared to publicly admit. And perhaps that was what made the silence feel so unsettling, because institutions built on tradition rarely change this dramatically without reason. Yet as questions multiplied, answers remained buried beneath layers of protocol, secrecy, and carefully controlled messaging. The palace continued projecting stability to the outside world, but internally, whispers reportedly grew louder about why this transition was accelerating now, at this precise moment, under such extraordinary caution. And as the silence inside Buckingham Palace deepened, attention quickly turned toward the one question nobody inside the institution seemed willing to answer directly: why now? Those familiar with the palace's internal structure say King Charles had been weighing this decision for months, perhaps even longer. But as his health battles continued to cast uncertainty over the monarchy's immediate future, reports suggest the king ultimately concluded that the institution could no longer afford hesitation. Catherine's calm discipline, careful restraint, and growing public trust had reportedly convinced senior advisors that she represented something increasingly rare within royal life: stability during an era defined by turbulence. For years, Buckingham Palace had relied on patience as its greatest survival strategy. Delay the difficult conversations. Protect the image. Preserve the illusion that time was always on the crown's side. But according to royal insiders, something changed as concerns surrounding the king's health became impossible to quietly dismiss behind ceremonial appearances and carefully measured statements. The atmosphere inside the institution reportedly shifted from cautious preparation to urgent calculation. Advisors allegedly began confronting a reality few within royal circles wanted to publicly acknowledge: the monarchy could no longer risk uncertainty at the very moment public confidence mattered most. And in those conversations, Catherine's name reportedly continued rising to the surface with growing consistency. What made her position so powerful was not loud ambition or aggressive influence. In fact, insiders claim it was the opposite. Catherine's restraint became her greatest strength. While royal life around her often seemed consumed by scandal, division, and emotional volatility, she reportedly maintained a discipline that senior palace figures viewed as essential for the institution's survival. Sources suggested King Charles came to deeply trust her judgment during delicate moments, particularly when tensions surrounding public image, family fractures, and institutional stability began colliding all at once. That trust, according to those close to palace operations, was not symbolic. It carried strategic weight. Because within the monarchy, trust determines proximity to power long before titles ever do. As the transition accelerated, advisors allegedly pushed for far greater visibility surrounding William and Catherine, carefully reshaping public appearances to reinforce the image of stable future leadership. Royal historians immediately began drawing comparisons to previous moments in Crown history, when the institution quietly repositioned its next generation before fully acknowledging the reasons behind the shift. The parallels unsettled many observers, not because history was repeating itself exactly, but because the monarchy appeared to be following its oldest survival instinct: once again prepare the future before the public fully understands why preparation has become necessary. And through every carefully managed appearance, every diplomatic assignment, every expanded responsibility, the palace reportedly worked to send one clear message without ever saying it directly: the future of the monarchy was already being organized around William and Catherine. Public reaction only strengthened that momentum. Reports suggested growing support for Catherine among the British public significantly increased internal confidence within palace walls. Senior aides allegedly viewed her popularity not as celebrity, but as institutional protection during a dangerously fragile period for the crown. In many ways, Catherine represented something the monarchy feared: it was slowly losing emotional credibility. People trusted her composure, they trusted her consistency. And perhaps most importantly, they trusted that she understood the burden of duty without appearing consumed by privilege. That perception reportedly became invaluable to a palace desperate to maintain relevance while navigating modern pressures unlike anything previous generations had faced. At the same time, Prince William was said to be quietly supporting a more modern but disciplined royal structure, one designed to reduce unnecessary chaos while restoring focus around a smaller, more controlled leadership core. According to insiders, William viewed Catherine not simply as his partner, but as an essential stabilizing force capable of helping carry the institution through years that now appeared increasingly uncertain. Together, they reportedly began operating with greater unity, greater visibility, and far greater influence than many senior figures inside the palace had anticipated only a short time earlier. Officially, Buckingham Palace framed the transition as continuity rather than disruption. That distinction mattered deeply. The institution understood that public reassurance depended on making change appear natural, even when profound shifts were unfolding beneath the surface. But behind closed doors, emotions reportedly became far more complicated, because every transition inside the monarchy creates winners, casualties, fears, and silent resentment that rarely reaches public view. And while Buckingham Palace attempted to present the announcement as seamless continuity, the reaction unfolding behind royal walls suggested the emotional consequences were only beginning. The moment Buckingham Palace confirmed Catherine's new royal role, the atmosphere across royal households reportedly shifted with remarkable speed. Staff members who had spent years carefully navigating delicate traditions suddenly found themselves adapting to a structure of influence that appeared to be evolving in real time. Some insiders described the transition as necessary for the monarchy's survival, while others quietly viewed it as the clearest indication yet that the institution's center of gravity was moving away from the old guard and firmly toward William and Catherine. Royal commentators immediately labelled the announcement a turning point, arguing that the palace was no longer preparing for a distant future, it was actively reorganizing around one. Behind closed doors, palace operations reportedly began restructuring around Catherine's growing authority. Senior households allegedly reassessed ceremonial priorities, diplomatic responsibilities, and future planning with increasing urgency as William and Catherine emerged as the monarchy's most stabilizing public figures. Public reaction only intensified that momentum. Early interpretations across media circles suggested overwhelming support for Catherine, with many seeing her calm discipline and measured public image as symbols of continuity during a deeply uncertain period for the crown. But while the public embraced the transition, insiders reportedly understood something far heavier unfolding beneath the headlines, because with greater influence came unprecedented pressure, and the role Catherine had now accepted carried expectations capable of reshaping her life forever. By nightfall, the deeper meaning of the announcement was still echoing through royal corridors. According to palace observers, Catherine had not simply accepted another ceremonial duty. She had stepped into a position tied directly to the monarchy's survival during one of its most fragile modern chapters. Royal insiders described the transition as one of the institution's most significant shifts in recent years, with William and Catherine increasingly viewed as the steady future the palace hoped could preserve public trust before further uncertainty emerged. Reports suggested King Charles was determined to secure continuity while he still could, reinforcing Catherine's symbolic importance inside an institution increasingly aware of its own vulnerability. Yet even as palace officials continued limiting details surrounding internal planning, the reality becoming impossible to ignore was far larger than any official statement. The monarchy had entered what commentators described as a defining transitional era, one shaped not by grand declarations, but by quiet transfers of trust, influence, and responsibility. And as Britain absorbed the significance of the palace's announcement, one truth reportedly echoed louder behind royal walls than ever before: the future of the monarchy may already have begun changing hands. Long before the public announcement was finalized, reports suggest royal strategists had already begun preparing for a future shaped far more heavily by William and Catherine than anyone outside palace walls realized. The monarchy, once anchored almost entirely around King Charles's reign, now appeared to be repositioning itself around a younger generation capable of carrying the institution through growing public scrutiny, political uncertainty, and relentless international attention. And at the center of that transformation stood Catherine, a figure palace advisors reportedly viewed not simply as a future queen, but as an essential pillar of long-term institutional stability. As global attention intensified around the future of the crown, insiders claimed international diplomats had quietly increased engagement with William and Catherine's office, recognizing their growing importance within royal operations. Palace planning allegedly began shifting toward generational continuity, carefully elevating the Wales household as the monarchy's most dependable symbol of modernization without abandoning tradition. Catherine's disciplined public image stood in sharp contrast to years of royal turbulence, scandal, and internal division that had shaken confidence inside the institution. And according to reports circulating through royal circles, the princess was now playing a larger role in discussions tied to future Commonwealth strategy, diplomatic outreach, and the monarchy's long-term global relevance. Every appearance, every statement, every carefully managed engagement reportedly became part of a broader recalibration designed to strengthen Catherine's visibility and reinforce public confidence in the future leadership of the crown. Yet behind the growing admiration and carefully polished unity, insiders whispered that the emotional pressure surrounding Catherine had become enormous. Because while the palace projected confidence, the burden resting on her shoulders remained largely hidden from public view. When the palace gates finally closed late that evening, an unusual silence reportedly settled across Buckingham Palace. The cameras were gone. The statements had been released. The headlines had already travelled across the world. But for Catherine, the moment allegedly carried far deeper meaning than public celebration alone. Palace insiders claimed she understood exactly what this transition represented, not simply another royal responsibility, but the beginning of a chapter defined by expectation, sacrifice, and historic pressure, unlike anything she had faced before. William was said to remain intensely protective as those responsibilities increased, while King Charles reportedly viewed the transition as essential for preserving trust in the monarchy before further uncertainty emerged. Royal commentators now openly predict that the institution is entering one of the most significant leadership transformations in modern royal history. Public support surrounding Catherine continues strengthening her symbolic importance nationwide. But the announcement has also left lingering questions echoing through royal corridors about what changes may come next, because behind the official statements and carefully controlled messaging, one reality now feels impossible for Buckingham Palace to fully conceal. The era of Catherine may have already begun. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.